So, very good morning, everybody who is here live on the Zoom this morning, and those of you joining us on YouTube, then good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are just now. So today is the second of our three teachings in 2024 on the Sangha, part of a larger set of teachings, three each, on Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. It's a very important topic, very basic topic, but if you're Buddhist, then you've taken refuge, and if you've taken refuge in whichever form, it's always refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So we do need to know. And we do need to know about these three refuges because they do form the basis for all the other more detailed, more sophisticated, perhaps more interesting teachings that you can come across. So let's start today wanting to learn and wanting to deepen our own appreciation of the Sangha, and as usual we do so with a very big mind, a very open, loving heart, and lots of care for our fellow beings, and reminding ourselves of our own refuge and our own bodhicitta aspirations and commitment. We take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and in the community of most noble minds. From this moment on until we reach the very heart of enlightenment. Through the practice of generosity and all six transcendent virtues, may we reach total awakening and every enlightened quality to be able to truly help sentient beings so lost in samsara. May each and every being be well, live long, be healthy, be well provided for, have good friends, find respect, live in places of peace and plenty, and most of all, may they practice Dharma. May they each create the causes for these good circumstances to be their wealth in future lives. May they be free from suffering and from creating causes of future suffering. May they discover the natural, sacred well-being that's totally beyond suffering, and attain the great equanimity that's free of closeness or distance from anyone.
Deyata shame shamawati shamita shatru kurim arachite karota keyori tejowati Olo yani beshuda nemale malapa naye kukure kaka grase Grasana omuke paramuke amuke shammedawane savagraha bandhanane nigrihitva Sawa bhava pravadina vimukta mara pasha savitva buddham buddha anukatita sava mare butsarita parishuddhe biga shantu sava mara kamani.
Glorious Guru, source of all blessing, ever present above our heads on lotus and moon seat, through your immense kindness, ever sustain us, that the accomplishments of body, speech, and mind flow from you, and we are one. So we continue with our can you call it, exploration of the Sangha. And it's not an easy topic for me, because usually when we teach a topic, we have a very clear idea what to say. It's already been done for us, by Gampopa, by somebody. There's always a great teacher who's written a text, and that text has then been taught by our own teachers, and so I just reproduce it in full, condensed, and the structure is all there. You must say this, this, and this. These are the key points. These are the details. But for the Sangha, there isn't really a text like that. It covers so much. We're looking at 2,500 years of history, so many things in so many countries, and it's complicated, and it's not clear. It's not clear, as I've said many times in these courses, but it's so striking, stunning, is there is just so little information available about 1,600 years of Buddhism in India. So little, so little. So the Sangha and its development is, we have to do what we can. So I put together this course according to the general guidelines that I feel, if Trungpa Rinpoche was teaching this, what would he have said? If Akon Rinpoche was teaching this, what would he have underlined? What would he have wanted you to take away from this course? And as I was saying just before we started, I think the main thing we'd want to take away, because otherwise all the the detailed information, it just disappears. We go to a teaching and then some of it remains, but a year later what's remained is maybe one or two points or a feeling, something that was triggered, woken up in us. Even if you've been every day listening to a couple of talks for a week or two, not much of it remains. So anyway, the thing that should remain from this course is gratitude. Gratitude, because it's there today, and this talk is the proof. You have access to Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, given more than 2,500 years ago, only because of the Sangha. Only because of the Sangha. At the time Buddha taught, nothing was written down. There's been a human transmission of the words, the ideas, and when we looked at the teachings on Dharma, we saw Dharma has two main aspects. The real Dharma, about life, how it is, and then the words that describe that, the conceptual analyses. But the real Dharma is what's happening in our mind, in life around us. That's the real Dharma. So, and then our Dharma path is about transforming the way we live, the way we act in the world, the way we are inside ourselves, for ourselves. That's the real Dharma. The rest is just blah, blah, giving us advice how to do it. So all of that, the reality and the words and the teachings and the methods, is only there for us. And it's like all things which are there for us. What is it Joni Mitchell says? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And it's very, very true. It's only when we don't have something anymore that you can start to realize. The food on our plate, you don't realize every day how wonderful it is to eat until there's no more money, there's no more food, and all those things. People in our lives, when they go away, when they die, then we realize how privileged we've been to know and to share life with other humans. So, and especially today, with internet and there's probably thousands of Dharma books now. You have such access to Dharma. But why? It's because it's been kept alive, not just as ideas, but as something lived, as a living example. And this is really the living heart of what we mean by Sangha. Sometime today I want to come back to that, or maybe next week, because when we look at Sangha, or when we look at Dhamma teachers, then the test is, are they the living example of what Buddha was and what Buddha taught? So, well, let's pick up from where we left off, and I'm kind of improvising. I've got some ideas of what I want to say, but I'm not quite sure about the order, and let's see how we get on. I think when we finished 2 weeks ago, in the last session, then we looked at some key members of the Sangha, both some male ones and some female ones. And then in the 3 talks we had on the Buddha, when we came to the Buddha's passing and the end of his life, he made it very clear. He said, when I'm gone, he said, I've taught everything I have to share with you. There is no more Dharma that you're missing. And when I'm gone, the Dharma will represent my presence among you. There won't be a new successor. So he appointed Mahakashyapa as head of the Sangha, but not as his successor. We have to get that difference. And the Sangha needed its leaders, people to keep it in order, and just to lead it. But the Buddha had taught everything. That was it. And now the duty over the coming centuries was to maintain the Buddha's teaching as transmission of ideas, but as living practice. And indeed, the living practice was the most important thing. One key point of the Sangha is that they live a life of purity thanks to their discipline. That purity is quite important. And in the support document, in the biography part about Mahamoggallana, one of the Buddha's 2 main disciples, you may have seen the passage I'm about to read. And I want to say, in your support document, there are some hyperlinks, and I made a mistake. So for the lives of Moggallana and Shariputra and so on, I've got links to texts from Theravada sources on the internet, and they all start khenpo.eu, because at first when I made khenpo.eu, it was a mirror site for khenpo.org. So I just copied. Everything was the same. Since then, I've totally transformed khenpo.eu into being the site just for these Zoom courses on Saturday. So the old links aren't there. So what I'm saying is, if you do want to check it out, and I don't think anyone's wanted to check out those links because nobody's come back to me to say they don't work. But anyway, if ever one or two of you did want to check out those links, instead of khenpo.eu, just do khenpo.org, and the rest is the same. So then this story about Mahamoggallana is, it says at one point, the Buddha sat in silence in front of the assembly, the monks who were with him, and all through the night. He sat in silence with them all through the night. And with dawn coming, he says, this assembly is not pure. So one of his main disciples, Mahamoggallana, was the one with the most clairvoyance through his practice of shamatha and his stability in the dhyana levels of meditation. So he scanned everyone's mind who was sitting there, and he saw that there was indeed one person who had quite impure thoughts, been sitting there during the night meditation session with quite some, he doesn't say what the impure thoughts were. So then Moggallana went over to him and he said, I think it's better you leave. And he asked him 3 times, and the monk wouldn't. So then it said, then he took him by the shoulder. I mean, I don't know if he actually evicted him physically, but he led him out of the room and then went back to his seat and said, the Buddha said, yes, now the assembly is pure. It's a strange moment because, of course, the monk who was having impure thoughts, whatever they were, the whole point of people coming to the Buddha was to learn to work with their impure thoughts. So everyone would have still helped him. He was still part of the Sangha. But for what was going on in that particular transmission, for what was happening then, purity was essential. And when we look at the stories from the time of Buddha, of people meeting the Buddha, leaving everything to follow him, it was the presence of the Buddha that inspired them. It wasn't the words, it was what he had to share because of what he was. Even from the very beginning of the Buddha's teaching, when he went to see the 5 ascetics that he'd spent 6 years with, they'd given up on him, they'd gone off to what's now Sarnath. But when he came, and they saw him coming, immediately they felt the difference. It wasn't what he said, it wasn't teachings in that sense. They just were wowed. Now, I know I talk about it a lot because it was the main, I suppose, the most brilliant time of my life. But in the 6 months I spent with the 16th Karmapa, it was like that every day. Every day you were with Buddha. He didn't need to say anything. He just was, and not just for us Buddhists who had faith in him. For ordinary people we met, they were just bowled over by his presence. It was so pure, so blissful, so totally captivating, as you had the feeling, this is it. It's as good as it gets. It's perfection, it's purity. So when in the life of the Buddha, his Sangha, the beings around him, the main ones that we have as the hundreds of arhats and bodhisattvas, their main job was to acquire that stability, that peace, that radiance, most of all, that purity of being, because it's from that purity that what? What did the Buddha say? after I'm gone, the Dharma is what replaces me. But that doesn't just mean the words and the ideas, the methods. It means there need to be the people who have mastery of Dharma. Because only from that mastery, from that purity, can the Dharma be taught. It's so obvious, but it's very, very useful to think about it. You need to be it, as well as to know how to quack it. You need to be it, the living embodiment. And so I wanted to say that. So then after the Buddha passed, Mahakashyapa was for about 20 years the leader of the Sangha and guiding it. And we saw already in the last sessions that once the Buddha was gone and the Sangha became the guardians of Dharma, there were some tensions. And in particular, we see that between Mahakashyapa and Ananda, between what was the Dharma. Of course, they remembered the Buddha's discourses, but it's the feel of it, the whole meaning behind it, the presence of it. So Mahakashyapa was very much a disciplinarian, a loner. He spent a lot of his life meditating alone. He was an ideal choice for keeping order once the Buddha was gone. And they're recorded in the Agamas that held in the Theravada tradition. It's recorded that some people said after the Buddha's death, oh, we're free now. We don't need to follow so many rules. We can, it was really kind of a relief that the discipline was going. And so because of that, then it was very, very good that Mahakashyapa was there to keep things in order. And and then if it happened, he's the one who organized with the king of Rajgir the first council where everyone tried to remember everything the Buddha had said. Ananda, the Buddha's cousin, whose vision of the Dharma was much less to do with strict discipline and more, the loving companionship and support for each other in the Sangha, the fact that we are friends in virtue, with no selfish agenda in our friendship, that kind of thing. That was very important for Ananda. Now, Ananda lived very, very long, and we're not sure how long he lived because we don't know very much about his birth. There are two versions about Ananda. One is that he was born more or less the same time as Buddha, in which case he lived very, very long. He lived to the age of 120. Another one is that he was born quite a lot later. And so he was quite young when he joined the Sangha. And anyway, there's a lot of research into that and nobody really knows. But Ananda was very definitely the second patriarch after Mahakashyapa. And so inspiring the Sangha with his own very beautiful, benevolent, loving, harmonious being. So then, if we look, we have very, very little information, but from the information we've got, very generally, you could say then what followed were several hundred years of the Sangha as this huge body, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, trying to maintain this purity and being guided by the purest amongst them. In my mind, it's just in my mind, but I share it with you. In my mind, there are the centuries of purity. And then in some of the Buddhist texts, the first 500 years after the Buddha are called the golden centuries or the golden age. And in some of Guru Rinpoche's texts, we find stories of demons, Maras, and how they wanted to destroy the Sangha, of course. Of course, that's what demons do, destroy goodness. And it said in their vision, because of the purity of the Sangha's conduct in the areas they were in, which was a lot of India, he said it was as though there was a wall of fire around India. They couldn't even get in to make trouble because they were held outside. The mantra I do at the beginning of the teachings is in that spirit. It's supposed to push all the Maras and the troublemakers away from our little moment together here. So anyway, there were these centuries where this purity of conduct transmitted by the Buddha, demonstrated by the Buddha for 45 years, carried by hundreds and hundreds of his disciples and perpetuated through the century, kept Dharma strong and helped it to spread. Now it had it had developed in central India, all the way central India and up to the south of what's now Nepal. But it had also spread significantly in two directions. One is northwest, up into what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, and along the Silk Route, as far as, if you know the towns, Taxila. Taxila was a very, very important place. So Dharma had spread up in that direction. And it had also spread down south to Sri Lanka, to Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And then, as we saw in the teachings we had in the Dharma sessions, we saw how, as the centuries went by, then how it went out of India, how it spread first to Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and then to China, and so on and so on. We looked at that in the Dharma teachings. But in the early centuries, the few centuries after Buddha, we have Buddhism in central India, and then those two antennae in Sri Lanka south and in the northwest, which Tibetans call Uddiyana, or Ujjain, Uddiyana. So then, kind of the next thing we know from history is about the Sangha, is records of the king Ashoka. Ashoka is about 3 centuries before the Common Era, so a couple of centuries after the Buddha. And Ashoka was what people call a Dharma king. I'll leave you to make your own judgment. But there were several, at least 3 very famous ones in the history of Buddhism, who start off their life as warriors, conquering. So that involves armies, murder, and not very nice things, but conquering. So Ashoka actually was the first person to unify India. He conquered so many kingdoms that it was most of India, and beyond India went up towards Pakistan and Afghanistan too. So he was a very powerful warrior in the first part of his life. Then these Dharma kings, in the second part of their life, they usually don't feel good. about all the damage they've done in the first part of their life. And they're the ones who convert to Dharma, and then they do lots and lots of amazing things for Dharma, for people. And in the case of Ashoka, he was fabulously rich, and he endowed many Buddhist viharas. It's the time when viharas started to become bigger, buildings where monks could stay and study and practice. And he also nurtured in the Buddhist spirit. The second of the 5 sciences of Buddhist study is the science of healing. And within the science of healing, there is medicine, a very broad science of healing, mind and body. So Ashoka also did amazing things for gathering medical knowledge from different countries and then sending medical missionaries and missions into all the Himalayan region, up into Uddiyana and all over India. So he did a lot of good things. And so we know something about this, and we know he was a great Buddhist sponsor. And so through that, one thing that we discover through the history that we've got, and the archaeology as well, is we know that this northwest antenna of Buddhism was more Mahayana inclined. And the southern antenna down in Sri Lanka had Theravada and Mahayana. And later on, centuries later, not in the time I'm talking about, Vajrayana, but it was Theravada dominated. So let's just leave that there. Then the next things we know, we need to move on a few more centuries. So now we're around the year 0, before the year 0 and the first century of our common era. So there something very, very interesting happens. It had started before up in the northwest, which we call, what's the best way to call that? Gandhara is usually the word people use, Gandhara. And if you look up on Wikipedia, Gandharan Buddhism, you'll see quite a bit of information and references, other links. So what we see coming into India in general, including Buddhism, are things that weren't so much there at the start. Devotional practices, iconography, images, statues. With the devotional practices, bit by bit, then came to the fore gods that had previously existed, but were given new, let's say, attributes. Very hard to talk about because it was happening in what we now call Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. So this was happening. We don't know a lot about it. I'm fascinated by it. I have my own ideas, but I have to be careful because my own ideas are my own ideas. So let's keep it minimal. But what is very clear from history and so on is that already from a couple of centuries BCE onwards, there was a Greek influence. The Greeks, very good artists and statue makers and painters, And so that took on up in Gandhara, and the influence went down into India. And so we start to find the first Buddhist imagery. And in those centuries before the Common Era, up to the year 0, then Buddha was never depicted. The only way he was depicted is as the Bodhisattva in his previous lives, in wall paintings, but he was never depicted as Buddha in his Buddha life. And up until then, so for about, 500 years, Buddha was represented by a footprint. Very interesting, very interesting. Not a foot, a footprint. And a footprint is the mark you leave. Really interesting. Buddha's footprint, or by a lotus flower, but no images of Buddha, because he manifested, what's a nice English word, severally in everybody's minds, in different ways for everybody. Everyone got what they could get from this great Buddha mind, which is the prime nature of the entire universe. That's what was happening in the life of Buddha. Everyone was getting a dose of the universe, if we use the word the universe, in its absolute purity. So Buddha wasn't represented. But then around the first century before year 0, the century afterwards, then in Hinduism we get texts, we get the, or some of their famous texts. I've gone blank on the names. Oh gosh, I've got flowers from the garden in my hair. And devotional practices. Before, Hinduism was mainly Brahmanical, was conceptual. It was mainly conceptual. It was mainly limited to what the priests did. It wasn't something the common people did so much. The priests, as the centuries went by, became more and more the ones who did rituals for the common people rather than just the Brahmins, who had their own world of spirituality and speculation. They came more into people's lives doing rituals for different things, for the dead and so on. And then as the centuries went by, the people started doing their own rituals, basically. And devotional Hinduism, devotional practices became quite common. That's what it seems to be. And this goes along with images, because to focus your devotion, an image is very, very helpful. And so images of gods for the non-Buddhists, and then images of Buddha. So the first images of Buddha came. And viharas, the dwelling places of the Sangha, became temples. That's big. It's huge. The places where they stayed together to meditate, to learn, to discuss, started to become also temples with images of the Buddha. The first and the earliest images of the Buddha happened up in Gandhara, in Pakistan, Afghanistan area. And they were modeled on Greek kings. So the first Buddha statues, I forget which Greek king it was, I never remember his name, but they were carbon copies. If you go to Greece and see the statues of that king, he looks like Buddha. And in fact, it's the other way around. The first statues of Buddha looked like that king, statues of kings made and queens, made them look much better than they were in real life. They were quite flattering, of course. So, and then, but some of it's fascinating because in the statues of the Greek king, then he has his main divine bodyguard who wields a club, got a big heavy club for bashing people and guarding the king. So this became Bodhisattva Vajrapani, the first images of Vajrapani, who these days is holding a Vajra, but the first images, he has a big club, just like the Greek ones. So anyway, it's to show, and we'll leave it there because I've got a lot to talk about and I'm diverting, but it's to try and show this body of the Sangha in the first few centuries was without the iconography, was practicing, and the purity of the Sangha was the main thing. Now, after Ashoka, 3rd century BCE, writing became more and more widespread in India. And so by that 1st century before zero, then writing became commonplace in Buddhism, and the scriptures which had been learned by heart, the teachings of the Buddha, were put into writing. And once there was writing, then there could be studying. And so the viharas, the places where people learnt by heart oral teachings and meditated together, became temples, and they started to become study institutions. And then the first shastras emerged, which instead of studying, we saw this in the Dharma teachings, I'm repeating, but this is about the Sangha. The shastras scanned the Buddha's teachings and pulled out the information on a topic that the Buddha mentioned in this sutra and that sutra, and put it all together so you have like all the Buddha's key teachings on karma, on virtue, or whatever it is. And so the shastras were composed by this emerging body of great scholars. And so then the shastras became important, and people could go to study institutions to study the Buddha's teachings in an accelerated, condensed way through the shastras. So monastic study institutions of note emerged. So then we get centuries after the centuries of purity. It's not that they lost the purity, but then we get centuries in which the keynote becomes study. And that's really when the Abhidharma teachings came into being. Although they're all there in what the Buddha taught, they're spread out everywhere in the Buddha's teachings. The details about the 5 aggregates and all the details of mind and matter and so on. So then Abhidharma became a big deal. There were 2 main schools that emerged in the Sangha. One was based on these shastras, these analyses, and in particular, one called the Mahabhashika. Mahabhashika was, it means the great compendium. It's like the first Buddhist encyclopedia. Amazing. A book, writings become new, it's coming in. You've got a book where you've got topic by topic what the Buddha taught. Oh, so neatly analyzed and formulated. Of course. analyzed and formulated according to the mind of the person who analyzed it and formulated it. You can't help that. It's like translations. Translations so often reflect the translator. So anyway, there was one trend which had a huge influence on Theravada Buddhism, and in Buddhism in the south, in Sri Lanka, that afterwards spread to Thailand and a bit to Burma and so on, other countries. Very much influenced by study, and in particular the study of the Shastras. History. You get a movement. What happens when you get a movement? You get a counter movement. So then some Buddhists weren't too happy with this. They wanted to go back to, well, let's not have Fred and George's interpretation of what the Buddha taught through these Shastras. Let's just learn what the Buddha said himself. So there was this, what became the Theravada study trend as one school. And then you get the Sautantrikas. Sautantrikas, they were the ones who wanted to go back to the sutras. It means sutra, antika, ones who followed the sutras. And so what we saw in some of the recent talks happening after the Buddha is that immediately after the Buddha, there were tensions, there were different feelings, different interpretations of the Buddha's teachings. That crystallized over those centuries and then became accentuated once things were written down, and there was this Theravada and Sautantrika reaction to it once those schools of thought developed. Now, they were there, but they were schools of thought and they were not embodied in institutions. So these viharas, dwelling places that became temples and then that became study institutions, it would seem did not belong to any one of those traditions in the sense of putting up a flag on the roof and saying, we're a Sautantrika monastery. It seems people lived very well together in the same institution, but there will be those who follow this teacher and those followed that particular trend. And of course, this developed into Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. The Mahayana Buddhism, often called the Buddhism of the North, was mainly in northern India, but in particular up in Gandhara, because Gandhara was on the Silk Road, and from Gandhara Buddhism spread into Tibet, into China, and from China into Japan. So northern Buddhism had its roots in the Buddha and what happened immediately after the Buddha. But it's only as the centuries went by and there was writing and there was formulation and analyses and all of that cultural evolution took place that the different schools of thought became so pronounced. So then we have these study institutions starting to get really big in the 5th century of our era, and that's when Nalanda started. And Nalanda, which was the first, I think, as far as we know, was the first university on our planet. Certainly now they've made the new Nalanda University in India. That's what they say in India. So when we look in Europe, for instance, we have Oxford was one of the earliest, but one in Spain, was before that, but this is more than 1,000 years after, or maybe not quite 1,000, but Nalanda was the first international university. People came to Nalanda from China, from Central Asia, from long, long way, because there was this famous place of learning. So Nalanda was not just a place of Buddhist learning, it became a place like a university where all learning was welcomed. And it was just amazing. It's amazing. So Nalanda really started in the 5th century of our era, and great study institutions, Nalanda, Udantapuri, Vikramashila, and so on, these huge Buddhist universities. To give you an idea of Nalanda, its buildings covered 13 square kilometers. 13 square kilometers. There's all these amazing ruins that we can't dig up because there are villages on top of them now. And you need to clear a whole area. It's a lot. When you see what has been cleared, you visit Nalanda, it's mind-boggling. The quality, the extent, the study halls they have. And when we hear about how it was endowed by the kings and the wealth of visiting people who made offerings, it had, some of the roofs were gold, some of the roofs were the color of lapis lazuli. You could see it sparkling from kilometers away. It's just an amazing institution. And so anyway, then we have the centuries of those monastic institutions. And then because they were centers much more open, then another strand of Buddhism started coming into the monasteries, which was the yogic strand, where people were with gurus, practicing in nature, not needing buildings, and so on. But their practices, Vajrayana practices, started coming into the Buddhist monastic world, into the Sangha. They became part of the Sangha, a yogi Sangha. So we've got a pure conduct Sangha. Then on top of that, a Bodhisattva Sangha, also practicing pure conduct. And then from 4th, 5th century onwards, we start to get the first yogic Sangha coming into the monasteries. Before it came into the monasteries, we have no trace. It's people living in forests, living in caves, living on mountain tops. It's great, you don't leave a trace. As Milarepa said, when I die, I want to die away from everything. So nobody even knows I'm dead, and there's no trace. Leaves no trace. But then, through the monasteries and through what's carved in stone, literally carved in stone, then we start to get some traces. The earliest tantras, Tara Tantra, Manjusri Tantra. So then, not to cut a long story short, we go fast forward to the 12th century. No, let's go back. No, let's stay there. No, let's go back and stay there. Invasions. History is full of war. And people sweeping across continents with armies and conquering. And then, yes. So the Northwest, Gandhara, beautiful place of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and a very special devotion to Buddha Maitreya up there. We had what called the Huns from various parts of Asia, white Huns, yellow Huns, red Huns, according to which century, who swept through with their armies, literally came through the easy places where you can cross. They were sort of on their way to India and pillaging, but they destroyed. They thought, they saw the temples at first, they thought they were castles and they must have riches because they were strong buildings. And so when we look at the Chinese pilgrims' accounts of what they saw of Buddhism as they came down the Silk Road and round through Afghanistan and Pakistan. If you look at Faxian, then forget when he is, he's about 6th century. He makes a list of the monasteries, the number of monks in them, what they practice as he goes through. You get the next Chinese pilgrim who goes through the ruins of this monastery, the ruins of that monastery, and because the Huns have been through. So much of what was in Gandhara was destroyed by the Huns. What survived was what was further over in Afghanistan, Bamiyan, where there were those famous statues, and what was up in the more remote valleys and hills that weren't touched by the transiting armies. So there was that, the Huns in the sort of 6th, 7th, 8th century, that kind of time. But then later in India, in the 12th century, then there were the Muslim invasions from Central Asia, and their Dharma was destroyed in India. The Indian Sangha was destroyed. No more Sangha in India from the 12th century until the last century when it's re-established. So if we're looking at the Sangha, after the 12th century, we're looking at the Sangha abroad. Now, we don't have time today. It's absolutely fascinating. If you really want to understand Buddhism, you need to understand how it went to China, how it went to Sri Lanka, how it went to Burma, Thailand, how it went to Tibet, and especially we're in the Tibetan fold, that history, how Tibet got its Dharma from northern India. But from a northern India influenced by Gandhara. And when we look at the story of Guru Rinpoche, it says he was born where? In the northwest, in Ujjain, in Gandhara. So anyway, when we're looking at the Sangha, then we're looking at, out of the great rainbow of Indian Buddhism, the red there and the yellow there and the blue there, the different strands of Indian Buddhism and its Sangha that then thrived in Sri Lanka, that thrived in Tibet, that thrived in China, and then later on in Japan as Zen. So when we think of the Sangha, we have to be aware of that. But then the main thing is, however all of that happened, they kept the Buddha's teaching alive, so we can access it today. So we take refuge in everything they did, in their goodness, in their purity, in their study and their detailed study and analysis of Lord Buddha's teaching. And then when it comes to the bodhisattvas and to the yogis and the yogic Sangha, their accomplishment, which kept the inner message of the Buddha's teachings, that we all have Buddha nature, we all are truly Buddha within. That message has to be kept alive, not just as words, because what use is it if you've got a book that tells you you're Buddha? There's no one who can show you how to become Buddha. There's nobody who's done it. So we have the Sangha. Now, where do we go from there? You've got a text with some of the famous Sangha, the 6 great ornaments and the 2 unsurpassable ones and so on. If I go through those, today's session's finished. And you do have them, you've got all the information in your support document. They are very important. Most important to us in Tibetan tradition, but which is based on the Bodhisattva teachings. The 2 most important are for sure Nagarjuna and a Sangha, for sure. Those are the two foundations, the two main pillars of all Mahayana teachings, all Bodhisattva Buddhism. Nagarjuna, nobody really knows where he was born, where he came from. His works, his writings are what we know him through. And then amongst his writings, it could well be that he didn't write everything that's attributed to him. There's so many writings from his time or just afterwards in his style, absolutely 100% in line with his thinking. But we can't really say. Some do say he was born in southern India. It's sort of not quite south-south, it's more like southeast coast around what is now Chennai. But anyway, that kind of area. But he was certainly a very great scholar. We usually place him as living somewhere between 250, 350 of our era. And he certainly put together the teachings of Prajnaparamita. The scriptures already existed, all the many different versions of Prajnaparamita, but he summed them up brilliantly, and put them into logic. So he made them undefeatable logic. Nagarjuna is the most frustrating person you'll ever come across. He's always right, and he always proves you wrong. And at first, when you listen to what he says, you think, come on, you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes. It's like the Buddha's teaching, you don't exist. Come on, I don't exist? What are you saying? Then you look into it, and you look into it, and the more you look into it, oh my goodness, I don't exist. But then what doesn't exist, what does it really mean? It means we don't exist lastingly, in a fixed way, with an eternal soul. Of course we exist as a changing story. That's what Buddha was teaching us. So like that, Nagarjuna carries on, not just about our personal self, about the way we perceive the world, and how none of it exists in the way we think it exists. It doesn't say it doesn't exist at all, but that's where it gets frustrating. He's always one step ahead of you, he's always right, and you've always been a bit stupid until you realize what he's saying, and you think about it, and you go and kick a wall and curse and think, like that, and then you realize he's right, and then after a few years you're trying to tell that to somebody else, and they think you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. You say, but it's obvious, can't you see it? They say, no, you're crazy. So Nagarjuna, he is top of the pile for that. Shunyata and all the teachings on interdependence and the logic that shows the fallacies of the way we perceive and think. He brings into scripture and into logic the teachings of the second turning of the wheel of Dharma from the Buddha. The Theravadas bring into reality, into scripture, into practice, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. So Nagarjuna, 250, 350, lived in that time window. Asanga, we have a clearer idea about. So he is another 100 years later. He was born up in Gandhara, somewhere up there. Up there means what? Present-day Kashmir, Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan's a very new invention. Kashmir, all of Kashmir, and then up into what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan. So at the time of a Sangha. It was different countries with borders and patriotism. And so I think he was probably born a Kashmiri. But he wanted to get into what's now the Pakistan, whatever country that was at the time, to study, because they had brilliant Buddhist studies there. So he had to, I don't think they had documents, travel documents, but he had to pretend he was a native of that country. He had to learn how to speak like them, look like them, act like them, so he could get in there and study, because there were problems. He was caught at the end, but nevertheless they let him stay because he was quite brilliant. So there are various versions of a Sangha's story, but a Sangha brings into scripture, brings into practice, brings into the Sangha the third turning of the wheel of Dharma from Lord Buddha. And so by the time of a Sangha, then we are kind of almost complete. We have a Sangha, a body of people over India, and now these afterwards in other countries exported. Between them, they carry all the Buddha's teaching. It's next week that we'll get to Vajrayana and the Vajrayana Sangha, and that perspective on things. So when we're looking at the Sangha, then I think mainly, according to the traditional teachings I've received, if I stop and think and look back at all of them, it's talking about two things really. You have a body of people keeping the whole thing alive and the spirit of it alive, the feel of it alive. And you have teachers. When we look, as I haven't done today, but in the support document that I'm asking you to look at, when we look at the 6 ornaments of the world, they are the disciples of Nagarjuna and Sangha, who really furthered their teachings through the centuries after them and led to the various Mahayana schools, which we're not looking into. But those were the great teachers and thinkers that gave us the thinking that went to Tibet. In theory, there was no new thinking in Tibet. All the thinking was thunk already in India. So what went to Tibet were the various schools of thought that had already been worked out in India, thanks to Nagarjuna, Asanga, and their very, very erudite disciples. You'll see after those 6 ornaments of the world, who were their disciples, you'll also see 2 more who were specialists in Vinaya, the discipline of the Sangha. So now one thing I have to tell you today, so I don't get sued, is, right, the Sangha, the key thing is discipline. Discipline means following rules. The rules are taken as vows, precepts for life. To become a novice monk or nun, to become a full monk or nun, and then there are intermediate ordinations as well. So they are based on rules. As I mentioned in the last session, Buddha himself said, after I'm dead, after I'm gone, you don't need to keep the minor rules that have emerged during my lifetime, but you need to keep the main rules. But Mahakashyapa, in the first council, insisted on keeping all the rules. We need to go back and ask Mahakashyapa why. But that's what happened. If there was a first council, and so on and so on. But anyway, that idea of the first council and Mahakashyapa and keeping all of the rules certainly influenced the Theravada system, which kept a certain set of rules and ordination ceremonies and transmission. There were two other traditions in India of ordination, which kept slightly different versions of the main rules the Buddha had made. So there's one that's called Savastivadin, or in fact it's called Mula Savastivadin, root Savastivadin. And that tradition of ordination is the one that went to the northwest, it's the one that went to Tibet and most of the northern Buddhist countries, but not China and some of the Far Eastern countries. So there's a third ordination tradition, which is called I never get it right. Mahagupta. I need to look just a second. Dharmaguptaka. So that's a third thing. So this is important because the Sangha has kept a purity. It's kept it through keeping the vows. So there are three main traditions of vows, the northern ones, the southern ones, and the Dharmaguptaka ones that are followed in China. The ones followed in China, the Dharmaguptaka, as far as I know, I'm not an expert at all, but as far as I know, it follows more the spirit than keeping all of those hundreds, literally hundreds of rules. In the time of the Buddha, the Vinaya that he taught, he didn't teach. He didn't teach rules. He never laid down a rule from his own initiative. Every one of those hundreds of rules came about by a situation where people came to the Buddha and they said, look, Fred's eating in the afternoon. Aren't we supposed to just go around begging in the morning? And then they said, yeah, no eating in the afternoon. Okay, then another one comes along. What's afternoon? How do we determine when we've got to stop? When you just can't even swallow a mouthful after that time. Oh, well, it must be put a stick in the ground and then the shadow's there, whatever. People came, watching each other, arguing about what should we do for the best. No, they were looking for the best. So they came to the Buddha and the Buddha arbitrated. Some things more serious, some things not so serious. And there's the spirit and there's the letter. Like the letter is not to carry money. Because money, as we know, causes trouble. Causes so much trouble. We see with inheritances, we see with salaries in the workplace, we see with power. Money is very often the beginning of trouble. So the Sangha were not allowed to carry any money at all. Buddha said, okay, no wealth, no money, you don't carry money. But then later on, as the centuries went by, and the bhikkhus in the Theravada system, if they are traveling and so on, there's so many things they're not allowed to do. They have to have an assistant who's not taken the vows, who can carry the money, and who can do this and do that, which is nice. And somebody gets a nice job, they're an anagarika usually, and they're serving somebody who's leading a very, very pure life. But kind of the spirit is, you need a whole servant and a whole kit to do. And wouldn't it be just a lot simpler if you had money, but you're not attached to it? And you can live without money, and you can use money. This was the argument in the first council. So it says, some people said, if you really were like the Buddha, and like we were with the Buddha, you just don't care about money. It's not about a rule, you carry it or you don't. Wealth It's not even in your perspective. It's a spirit. It's a spirit. So anyway, you need to know there are the three traditions of ordination and degrees of totally strict by the rules or not, and that ordination went to Tibet from the Mula-Savastibadin tradition. Tibet didn't get or didn't keep, if it had it, full female ordination. So there was a big conference a couple of decades ago from Buddhist scholars from all traditions to see about re-establishing this bhikkhuni transmission. And it still existed in China, so they had to see, is the Chinese tradition, does it really go back all the way to Buddha? If so, then we can continue it into the other traditions. I mean, it's very interesting. The first two non-Tibetan monastics I knew in Samiling, one of them was Lodro Tai. He was an English person, and he got ordained in the East. He was a monk. And then the other one was, her name was Annie Yeshi. She was a nun. And so she was ordained in Rumtek. She was the second one after Sister Palma to take Tibetan ordination. And Sister Palma sent her to Samiling to help us. But she wanted to become bhikkhuni. So at first we had her in red robes. Then she disappeared to China and came back in black robes as a fully ordained nun. Anyway, it's quite a long story. But many years later, in Bodh Gaya, hundreds of nuns from various traditions, but the Tibetan tradition went and received the full ordination, some from Samiling. And one of my very, very good friends, a nun, she went there to receive it. She actually died in the ceremony under the Bodhi tree in meditation. It was an amazing thing, amazing person. She had dakini marks on her body and all sorts of things. She was a very, very special person. And she went out there, and the night before the ordination, she was sitting in meditation under the Bodhi tree, and she died in meditation. And so she got a super send-off for all the rest of the Sangha that was there in Bodh Gaya. And it was kind of, anyway, that's another story. Her life story is just amazing. When I first met her, she was a lay person who had a heart condition. And they'd actually, she was in Spain, and they called, she was dying in the hospital, and they called Geshe from the local center to come and do prayers for her. And he put his hand on her heart and did prayers. And she survived. So she survived. And then after a couple of years, she became a nun. She did a 3-year retreat in Samiling. And then she went out and then died under the Bodhi tree. So she had this amazing, like in football, extra time. From the time the Geshe put his hand on her heart to dying under the Bodhi tree. Extraordinary person. Anyway, so now in the Sangha, what could I mention? What should I mention other than that? The 8 bodhisattvas. When in Tibetan Buddhism, when we take refuge and we have a refuge tree, there are of course thousands of bodhisattvas, but then there are 8 very famous ones. I need to tell you about those very briefly. They embody, they're all bodhisattvas, they're all very similar. How can you say inside themselves in that respect? But in their manifestation, they embody 8 key aspects of the Bodhisattva mind. So we have Manjusri, who embodies wisdom. He has all the other qualities, but in particular, he embodies wisdom. We have Avalokiteshvara, Chinrazik, who embodies the Buddha's compassion, or the compassion of the Buddha mind, which is becoming apparent in bodhisattvas. Then we have Vajrapani. Vajrapani embodies the Buddha's power. So when we say, what is Buddha mind? When we study Buddha nature and Buddha mind, you have these 3 things: wisdom, compassion, power. So those 3 bodhisattvas, very, very famous, very important. And then Bodhisattva Maitreya embodies the Buddha's activity. And the present Maitreya is like an ambassador, it's like a regent, embodies the Buddha's activity in this world, in all the worlds. And then the next one is Sitigaba. Sitigaba means who embodies the earth, the power of the earth, is very much followed in China and very much to do with blessing the land and the harmony of the elements. More than it's not the land, it's the harmony of the elements, so that so the weather happens in the appropriate way in the right seasons. It's the opposite of what's happening now, where the seasons are going and the weather's going wrong. So harmony of the elements, and in particular of the earth, that's Sitigaba. And then there's one, Savani Varana Vishkambi, very long name, and he embodies the qualities of the Buddha. I'm sorry I got that wrong. Then Shitigaba. That's something I need to check. I'm not sure of my own notes, excuse me. Yeah, I've copied something wrongly in the document I sent you. I've got this increasing the qualities of the land twice. So anyway, we've got Sarvani Varana Vishkambi. He embodies the Buddha's qualities. And Shitigaba embodies the merit of the Buddha, the merit. Then there's Akashagaba, which means the embodiment of space. And that represents, depending, it says the Buddha's blessing. But blessing is a funny word, really. It means everything and nothing. It means particularly the ability to purify karma through the Buddha's presence. Through the presence of goodness, the Buddha mind, what is pure in everything, the ability of that to erase karmic impurities. And Samantabhadra is the last one. It represents the Buddha's power to create prayer and aspiration. When we look at the Bodhisattva levels, you see on one level there's a particular aspect of Buddha mind which emerges, which is the ability to create prayers that work. Basically, we can all write prayers, but prayers that have blessing. So there are those. The 16 arhats you find mainly in Chinese Buddhism. There were many hundreds and hundreds of arhats, but these were super arhats. They're what are called superbly gifted arhats with many skills and qualities who made a special promise to remain in our world to help and guard the Buddha's teachings. There are 16, in some traditions they become 18, but there are root 16 arhats. There's a brilliant painting of them by the present Karmapa, 17th Karmapa. They have fantastic faces. And the original faces appeared to somebody, I forget who, a great Chinese master in a dream. But anyway, they are part of another Sangha. We'll stop here for today, but a Sangha now that we'll explore next week in our final session on the Sangha. So today we've looked at the Sangha in our world as human beings, the great historical figures. We've seen a bit about how the Sangha emerged in different areas of India and then abroad from India. But that's only part of the Sangha. When we talk about the human Sangha and when we take refuge, then what the scriptures say is there needs to be a minimum, a quorum of good people who've kept their vows and who've lived in purity for 10, 20 years, depending which version, before you can say, this is the Sangha. You need 4 fully ordained ones who've kept their vows for at least 10 years without any breakages. Then you've got a bit of the feeling of purity, of correctness, goodness. And what we'll look at next week, and it's a bit of a delicate topic, is very delicate topic these days. Who is really Sangha? What do they need to be? What do they need to embody to be worthy of our refuge? So when we look at spiritual teachers, what are we really looking for to make them a Sangha? You know, the Sangha, our elders on the path, our guides on the path. So we'll come back to the definition of Sangha, why we need them, but then we'll look at non-human bodhisattvas, arhats, beings in which we take refuge, and who are, in Mahayana Buddhism, our real focus as Sangha. Anyway, that's for next week. So today we're in a relatively, you say, safe area of human beings. So let's dedicate. May whatever virtue was created by this session contribute to the state of omniscience being attained by the main enemy, mind's defilements, being completely defeated. Through that, may each and every sentient being become freed from the ocean of existence, troubled by its waves of rebirth, aging, sickness, and death. May this precious bodhicitta arise in those in whom it's not arisen. May its development know no setbacks, and may it increase ever more and more. Through this virtue, may we quickly achieve Mahamudra and establish every single sentient being in that same accomplishment. So thank you very much, and I don't know if you've got some comment you'd like to make or question you'd like to ask.
Ken, I would like to say that you are such an amazing well of wonderful information, memories, that how many people are there with memories and experiences as yours? And I hope that you will record them somehow. I don't know how you will find the time, because you give so much of your time to us and you have your own practice to do. But it would be terrible if all your stories were lost. Have
Yeah,
you
I've
started to
thought
write
of
them?
it. I thought of it. It's a long story in itself, the thinking of it. Um, I started 10, 12 years ago, and it was amazing. It's good, and I've done a lot of writing in my life, mainly about Buddhism and writing stuff for Samiling and so on. But good writing it just comes by itself. It's like diarrhea; it just comes all by itself. and hard writing is like constipation, because it really takes a lot to get a little bit out. So anyway, the first bit, up until taking refuge in Samiling, so the first 23 years of my life, was written no problem. It's an interesting story in itself, and that's already a couple of hundred pages. But then the flow literally stopped. The tap went like that. And over the last 10 years, once or twice, I've tried, and I fiddled about with what was already written. I've already written some stories of my time with the Karmapa, 16th Karmapa, mainly because people asked me for their own books, their own publications. And so that's some of that time is written, but it just wouldn't work. And then a couple of years ago, I understood why. I understood partly why when Akon Rinpoche died. And then since then, and everything that's happened, sometimes information needs to settle, and to settle into its own past, and to be a story that in a way you're no longer involved with, so that you can look back and really see what went on there. When you're in the thick of it, you can't see what's going on. You're very prejudiced, biased in one way or another. But what happened between 1972 and 2013 is mainly the story I've got to tell, I suppose, up until Akon Rinpoche's death. That's where the heart of the story is. After that, there's nothing new. It's more of the same. It's traveling, teaching like I've been doing before, until COVID and lockdowns, and then since then I've not traveled at all. So if it comes back, then I will very happily write it. And because I'm not traveling teaching, I should have time. I don't know why, but I can't imagine how I traveled before. I was half the time traveling, half the time at base. Now I'm just at base. I don't seem to have any more time, spare time. But I would very much like to do that, because so many people have asked, and because it gives, I think more than anything, into Akon Rinpoche's work in Samiling, and not just in Samiling. Samiling, that's the problem. For me, what I see as a problem is that what people have told about Akon Rinpoche is so Samiling based. It's Samiling people who made films, who made the books, and it's Lama Yeshe who made the book about Akon Rinpoche, but then Lama Yeshe wasn't with him when he was abroad, and his work abroad was just so amazing. His work, humanitarian work abroad, his Dharma work in Europe, his Dharma work in Africa, and so on, it's a huge story. It's there, but it doesn't have the space. And because I traveled with Rinpoche and helped him to establish so much of that and heard his thinking about it, and we spent so much time together. We could talk about things, naturally, not as a disciple with a Rinpoche, and please Rinpoche, tell me about this, and the way a Rinpoche has to talk to disciples, because it's complicated. We could just have a good laugh about things, and we had an incredibly naughty telepathy as well. And it was so embarrassing because we'd be in places, like round a dinner table with a dozen people, and we couldn't catch each other's eyes, because if our eyes met, I knew what he was thinking, he knew what I was thinking. And sometimes our eyes didn't meet, and we look, and we both burst out laughing, and people say, "What is it?" We know what's this? And I'm saying, "It's nothing. It's nothing." And so much of it, unrepeatable, sort of in jokes. But that story, I don't know if it will benefit anybody, but I feel a sort of a duty to share at least some of it. And I think it's taken these last 10 years since Rinpoche's death to get the perspective on what should be told and what could be told without causing too much trouble. When I was writing the introduction to the second part of the book, it actually said I have to stop here for the moment, because if I write everything I want to write, I'll be sued. And for one thing, because it was the inside information that, things like the Sojo Rinpoche scandal and so on, that wasn't a scandal at the time. It wasn't all in public. You have the inside information and so on. So I thought I'd be sued, and it would cause a lot of trouble. And that's so. Anyway, I've thought about it. Thanks for the request. I really appreciate it. Anything about the Sangha?
Yes, hi Ken. You made the point that 2,500 years of history, there's been pretty much very little, in fact, written about Sangha and individuals. And I guess there's even less written, therefore, about the subsequent lives of some of those who didn't become arhats or bodhisattvas. I presume that they, at some stage or other, they were reborn as human beings, and we don't know, or maybe we do, but I don't know who they were. And it leads me to the question, do the leader or teachers who we have today, how many of them do we know who they were in the past, whether at the time of the Buddha or in the centuries that followed?
No, there are stories. There are stories for some of them, and glorious stories for many of them. But talking with Rinpoches themselves, right? Like knowing who you were before is mainly for tulkus or reincarnations. They're the ones who often have the stories. And as their reincarnations go by, then of course things happen. They have a life where they have their own memories of past lives, or their disciples have a vision that in the time of Buddha, this person was there, and so on. So the stories do build up. with reincarnate lamas. But the problem is, what the best Tibetan lamas that I've met say is that the Tibetan tulkus, reincarnate lamas, only about 1 in 15 is really the reincarnation of who they say they were. Not 1 in 15 isn't, 1 in 15 is, which means 14 out of 15 have been chosen for various reasons to take the place of a lama who died. It's very embarrassing. But more and more, just say honestly what went on in Tibet. And they made jokes about it. Things would happen. For instance, there'd be a family that always gave the butter for the butter lamps of the monastery. And it became, over the generations, assumed that the elder son would be recognized as a tulku, which meant that they'd have a nice position in the monastery, sometimes no more than that. And then amongst themselves, the Rinpoches would call that one butter lamp tulku. Of course, he had a proper name, it would be tulku tashi or tulku this, but amongst themselves, he was there because of that, or because of all sorts of reasons, political reasons, and influence. And if that monastery loses its lama who dies, then a big monastery and a famous lama can find a reincarnation, then they've got influence on that monastery. It gets very political, incredibly political. There are a lot of corruption, a lot of things gone wrong. The Tibetans were refugees, and it's so hard being a refugee when you've had so much taken away in culture, and very hard to see fault in what was in your culture, in your own culture. And it's taken the decades, 60 years now, that so many of them privately or even more publicly do say just how corrupt some things came in the tulku system. But despite all of that, I think there are some who are very genuinely, who they are, who they say they are. If I speak just from my own experience, like Gyaltsab Rinpoche, for instance, in his story, we get the previous Gyaltsabs, and then when we get before there were Gyaltsabs in Tibet, he was this disciple of Milarepa, and then all the way back to the time of Buddha, when he was Buddha's disciple Ananda, right? So that's in the story. And you could see why, when you look at the history of the Gyaltsabs, how they've always served the Karmapas in Supu so brilliantly, like Ananda served the Buddha. You could understand them saying he embodies the very spirit of Ananda. There's already that. But then I spent a couple of months traveling with him, interpreting for him. And at one point he was telling me a story from time of Buddha. And it's one of the most brilliant experiences I had, because he kind of switched. He started off telling the story. Then all of a sudden he was there. It was really, and he didn't even realize, he lit up. He lit up and he was there, and he was describing how the Buddha was there, and there was Devadatta there, and they found this dead elephant. It's a story of getting a dead elephant out of a village because it was rotting and stinking. And it was too big, they didn't have big digging machines to shift it. And so they asked for Buddha's help. But when he was describing that story, he was so much there, I was there. It completely took me there. It was a memory. Then all of a sudden, when the story was finished, he kind of realized. Then he went, in 1 second, he went very serious. It was over. He's very much like that, Gyaltsab Rinpoche. He's incredibly fast. He say something funny, he'll laugh, and then it's finished. And before you even got the joke yourself, you go, it's over. It's literally like that. When he speaks about 3 or 4 times the speed of most people. He thinks so quickly. So there, I really believe for myself that he really is the reincarnation of the previous Gyaltsaps, and that they were going all the way back to Ananda, Buddha's time. But who knows? Who knows? Who can tell us? We can't know.
Yeah, well, I had the same feeling. If you remember, when you came to Dublin many years ago with Gyaltsapa, and he taught the Four Noble Truths and Four Dharmas of Khenpoken, it was. If you remember, I took assiduous notes and prepared the book.
I still have
and
them.
It was like getting a teaching from Ananda, because he was so precise and so methodical. You know, he was like describing this 100,000 jigsaw puzzle. That this is the first part, the second part, the third part. You know, the way it's all structured. And he just had an amazing ability to sort of go through all these thousands of pieces and then suddenly bring you back to one point by saying, well, we're going back to the second part of the first part of the fourth. And it was just amazing how his memory or understanding of the teachings, it was like Ananda having this complete understanding of them. Yeah, so I've never forgotten that.
Yeah, he's amazing. It's almost ready, but this is an early draft. It's bigger, but I've been involved in making a book on Gyaltsab Rinpoche.
When will almost become actual?
It's very picture book, beautiful book. Well, when it will be available to the public, maybe this year. Later, there'll be a couple of hundred hardbound copies given to him to give to people first. And then either it will be published as a book. I think Shambhala might do it. There's an interest. But that will take time to get into print. Or we can put it on internet, then it will be a website.
Oh, that would be good.
That's what I want to do. I nobbled it a couple of years ago, the domain name, gyaltsap.org. So I've got that ticking over, not with anything on it, waiting to become this book.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's nice because I interpreted for him in 1984, wasn't it, in Dublin and Europe. I think it was 84, yeah. And there we were together for, I think, 4 months altogether. And but then I hadn't seen him since until 2015, when I led a little pilgrimage in India. Then we went to Sikkim for a couple of days, and then the idea of this book emerged differently. So ever since 1984, I wanted to pay back his kindness, because he was so kind to me, so kind in every way, and he taught Bodhisattva's way of life, the Kinjuk that we're going to start in 2 weeks' time, the Abhidharma teachings and so on, came from him. So I always wanted to repay his kindness, but he always was far away, never came back to Europe. So doing this book is really, for me, a wonderful thing.
From the heart.
Yeah. Okay, well, we seem to have no more questions on the Sangha. So wish you all a very good week. We've done the dedication, and take good care, everybody.
Thank you, Ken. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Cheers now. Ciao, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ken.